Okay, so just to finish that last thought, because the video only allows me to do 15 minutes at a time. Uh, she says this. She says, "Look to my little babes, my dear remains, and if thou love thyself, or lovest me, these O protect from stepdame's injury." And so she knows that if she were to die in the birthing process of this child, there would probably be a stepwife or a stepmother that would step into the lives of her children, and that it's possible that this woman might not be as loving and maybe more harsh and stern than Anne Bradstreet was, and might injure her children in some sort of emotional way, and that it was Simon's responsibility to step in and protect her children from that kind of damage or harm. Okay, so for this lecture, we're going to talk about Anne's major work, the 10th Muse. We're really going to more or less, instead of approaching the content of it, we're going to talk about the publication of it and how that came about, because in itself is its own fascinating story. So over here, you'll see this is the title page for the original first edition, which was published in 1650. The story goes that Anne Bradstreet's brother-in-law, John Woodbridge, the Reverend John Woodbridge, was traveling to England. And while he was traveling to England, he had taken a copy of the manuscript with him. And while he was there, he was looking for a publisher for Anne's manuscript of poetry. And she had continued to send some of her poetry to him across the Atlantic for him to enjoy while he was there in England for an extended period of time. And he was one of the many family members who was very interested and appreciated and enjoyed her poetry. This is kind of a reminder that commonplace books and even personal writings like poetry were always some semi-public writings. It was commonly shared in parlors or in family events and affairs, or shared to individuals, whether the poem was dedicated to the person or it was just sharing the expression of somebody's art in some sort of semi-public way. And John had thought that her poetry was very good poetry. In fact, there is the dedication that's even worthy at looking at here briefly. And so I'm just going to go ahead and highlight some of these. It says, Epistle to the Reader by John Woodbridge. Um, but I fear 'twill be a shame for a man that can speak so little to be seen in the title page of this women's book. It is the gift of women not only to speak most, but to speak best. And so he's introducing the work, and he doesn't want to say very much, but he wants to say that a woman's work is noteworthy and worthy of listening to, which is something that is pretty innovative for this time period, and empowering to women in general to hear this from a man. Uh, and so there is some question to whether the talent of the work might be so talented that it might be considered a man's work, and could a woman really produce this kind of work? And John Woodbridge attests by his own personal testimony that this indeed is Anne Bradstreet's work. Anne Bradstreet had a number of major influences, and so some of those influences are classic influences that people could expect. Dante, the writer of the Divine Comedy; Milton, the writer of Paradise Lost; Spenser, the writer of the Fairy Queen, which is a poetic retelling of Le Morte d'Arthur, or the tales of King Arthur and his knights. But the most influential of those people was Du Bartas, and so we'll talk about him in a little bit as well. But some people would have maybe been concerned that she might have been borrowing or using widely these previous works for her own lyric, her own verse, her own poetry. And John Woodbridge is trying to, in many ways, through this dedication, uh, help console people to understand that no, this is indeed original work from Anne Bradstreet. So Stephen Botel in 1642 signs a contract to publish Anne's manuscript. It goes into publication, and when she discovers that it's been published, she's shocked. She writes her own poem, which is one of the readings that you had to write upon the publication of her author's book. And in many ways, she, through lyric and through verse, writes about just kind of the humbling idea of seeing the imperfections or the flaws of her own poetry and work. Uh, 1650, it's published. By 1658, it's listed as one of the most vendable books in England in the bookseller William London's catalog. It goes into a second edition of the very same work with some additional poems in 1678 and some editorial changes by Anne Bradstreet herself. This second edition has a third edition, which is just a reprint in 1758. And then in 1867, John Harvard Ellis published a new edition, which was reprinted again in 1932 and 1963. When we talk about her major influence, we need to keep an account of who Guillaume de Salus du Bartas is. He is a late 16th century Huguenot who was part of the Huguenot court of Henry of Navarre. Henry Navarre was the Protestant Huguenot king who, after Henry III was assassinated, he was the nearest claimant and he became king of France. And this led to the end of the French religious wars in France. He was the one who famously said that France is worthy of a mass. And so he, in order to save France and to become its king, he converted officially to Roman Catholicism. But he was the one who enacted the Edict of Nantes. And with the Edict of Nantes, there was tolerance throughout all of France so that the French Protestants, the Jansenists, and the Roman Catholics could all live in harmony. You may not be very familiar with French post-Reformation period, but the Jansenists were basically Roman Catholics that had a Calvinistic, or what we would say is an Augustinian understanding of God's sovereignty and election. And then, of course, the Huguenots were French Catholics who were profoundly influenced by Calvin's Geneva and his missions sending of pastors into France to preach throughout the entire Reformation. So Guillaume de Salus de Bartas was a Huguenot. He was a Protestant Reformed disposition that took on a Reformed Calvinistic sensibilities. His first weeks was first printed in Paris in 1578. This is the title of the English translation by Joshua Sylvester in 1605 of his Divine Weeks and Works, which were dedicated to King James and reprinted 6 times in 1641, just so that you have an understanding of the significance of a reprinting. Anytime a work was printed, it would probably had a print run of between 500 and 1,000 copies during the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And so to go through 6 printings, there were anywhere between well, this is 6 reprintings, and so that means 7 printings altogether. So there were anywhere between 3,500 and 7,000 copies of his Divine Weeks and Works in print in England. And considering population density, that's a high volume. This was a very celebrated work, maybe one of the most popular works in the early 17th century. And so the first weeks is a poetic verse that takes you through the 7 days of creation and in 7 days. And then the second week takes you through different eras or different ages. One might even say dispensations of Adam in day one, Noah in day two, Abraham in day three, David in day four. And so day five and day six and day seven were never actually written. But basically, this was going to be a biblical theology, a Reformed Calvinistic theology that was put to lyric or to verse. Very early on in this collection of poetry, even in day one, we have this really articulate description of the Trinity that I have down here. It says, "The Trinity, this Trinity, which rather I adore in humbleness, when busily explore in the infinite of nothing." Builded all this artificial gear, rich glorious ball, wherein appears engraven on every part the builder's beauty, greatness, wealth, and art. Art, beauty, wealth, and greatness that enfolds the hellish barking of blaspheming hounds. And so there's this strong understanding of the Trinity, the strong understanding of the creation, the great glorious ball or the globe. Uh, and in every part is beauty and greatness, wealth and arts being portrayed by the triune creator himself. And so this is just like one sampling in the work. We will uh, be able to look at and talk about more on Friday. I'll point to you more pieces when we go into our conference, but he was a significant figure. King James really liked Du Bartas' art, and so King James met him in 1587. And of course, Joshua Sylvester's work was dedicated to King James, and so King James's affirmation of this work was probably went a long way in spreading the renown of this work. So this was Anne Bradstreet's most influential person when she talks about in her poem, her epitaph to Elizabeth, she describes Elizabeth as a phoenix. And what's really interesting is in the Joshua Sylvester's dedication of this poem, he also talks about Elizabeth as a phoenix. And so there's other allusions or ways in which she picks up on the language and even the tone. Her quaternion is structured as four fours, and this is structured in 7 days and a second week that has 7 days that cover 7 ages. And so who knows? There might have been a third week, or maybe the seventh day that took over a literary plenary understanding of Revelation, maybe. We can only conjecture how far Guillaume de Salus de Bertha was planning to take this particular work. So anyway, this is an introduction to this particular influential poet who honestly most of us do not know and are not familiar with his Saman, the weeks, uh, his great poetic epic work. So this ends this lecture, and we'll check in on Friday together and have a great conference about Anne Bradstreet, historiography, Bartas, the manuscripts, all of these things we'll talk a little bit more about.